While we move on to questions of Randy on his part of the liaison update,
Chairman,
if you would do that, we'd appreciate it.
Appreciate the opportunity to be here and give you an update from Los Alamos. There's a lot going on at Los Alamos and a lot of interest in what's going on at Los Alamos. And Pete actually covered a substantial part of what we could. That's okay. Pete and I work together quite seamlessly at times. And so I want to talk a little bit about the nitrate salt, a little bit of a complementary content with the chromium plume activities. And then there was a little bit of press this weekend on a soil vapor extraction project at Los Alamos at Area L. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a broader background than you might have seen in the newspapers over the weekend. The newspapers actually invoked the CAB. And so I thought there might be some questions that would understandably come up on that topic. The nitrate salt waste, I'll go through a little bit different order than this shows. The Accident Investigation Board, and I saw JR in the back of the room, and I think he's going to be given an opportunity to talk, and so he can fill us in explicitly on Project REACH and how that flows into the Accident Investigation Board. But from what we understand, that's going well, and we expect to see that report late February or early March.
When you say that report, you mean
the accident
AIB?
The AIB report.
Okay.
Now, the significance of that for us is that we are going to rely primarily on the external investigations for our formal corrective action plan, because that has the standing and the credibility that is important for the path forward beyond all of the work we've done internally to understand what may have happened and what may have gone wrong. But the first bullet on this chart, we are not standing still waiting for this report. We have been doing a lot to understand what needs to happen to support a path forward for the nitrate salts. We've invested a lot to do the science investigations in terms of trying to explain what may have happened. And our scientists are now turning the corner from trying to explain what may have happened at WIP to what do we need for a technical basis for the path forward. And so there's a lot of activity that's already geared up and important for the path forward as we await the accident investigation report to be finalized and form that basis. So we've got a lot of activity right now in a preliminary sense to develop a corrective action plan to address the things that we anticipate in the AIB report. There was a report from the Inspector General that came out in the end of September that talked about the procedural weaknesses that contributed to the WIP event, and we've had that as a formal basis for actions on how to improve the control of our procedures that had a role in the WIP accident. And we're well along in implementing a very robust revision to that whole process that addresses some of the core issues that we discovered. So you will likely see a fair amount of press as the AIB report is released. We're all very interested in what that has to say, and it not only may it answer some questions that people have about what happened at WIP, it will also provide a very important basis for corrective actions that we need to implement in order to move forward with the true waste operations.
Randy, do you expect that corrective actions plan to be so many days after the AIB report?
I don't have a specific number that I can quote you. We have a lot of preliminary work to be done. Until we actually see the AIB report, it's difficult to project exactly how that will play out. But rest assured, we have geared up with ample resources to put all the horsepower we need to behind that activity as soon as that report hits the street.
Okay. Thank you.
Pete mentioned a little bit about the chromium plume. We actually have some successful progress on the initial activities that go beyond just monitoring the plume, which we've done in the past, and now starting to extract some of the the chromium from the groundwater. And the first extraction well was operational this fall. It shut down when the cold weather came because that impacts the freezing impacts the operation. So it's a seasonal campaign, but it was a very successful campaign for the first 2 months. And there's a number of other wells that are in the overall plan that ties into what Dave McEnroy was describing very briefly before. So that's progressing well, and it's a very important initiative, as Dave did assert. It's our highest priority at this point to move forward on
And
that.
when you say 7 pounds of chromium, is that chromium 6?
That is chromium 6, I believe, Dave. Yeah.
Okay.
Randy,
Yes.
so we only pumped chromium for 2 months in this whole last summer?
After this well was drilled and the pumping was initiated, there were 2 months of operation before we had to shut down because of winter weather.
So there's no way of telling whether that plume has shrunk or...
So we have an array of monitoring wells that we are going to continuously monitor. We have a plan that includes extraction from a number of locations. This is the first location. And then right now we're land applying the groundwater that gets pulled up and cleaned up. In the future, we are proposing and have plans in place to have injection wells to replenish the groundwater. We're all mindful of the importance of groundwater as a resource. And with the combination of extraction wells and injection wells, the intent is to stem the spread of the plume and also try to deplete the plume of this contaminant over time. So that's the overall strategy in a nutshell, and we have maps of where these wells are planned, and there are aspects of this path forward that will require permitting and agreements, and so some of those are just in the early stages. So this is a plan rather than a fait accompli, but that's the overall picture for the chromium plume. So to the soil vapor extraction, in the press this weekend, there was some concerns raised that we were not using granular activated carbon filters in the operations of this project and releasing materials to the environment that were being pulled out of the ground in the area of this plume. We did use those filters in the exploratory phase, trying to understand what concentrations could be extracted with the methodology that we're using. The results of the measurements showed that we were somewhere in the neighborhood of 1% of our permit limits in terms of the concentrations that were coming out. And so with a lot of discussion and coordination and collaboration, it was decided that it wasn't necessary to filter the effluent as we go forward. Pete and both the field office and the laboratory collaborated and consulted and had discussions with regulators and stakeholders in the area to make sure everybody understood the technical basis for that not being required. What didn't come out in the paper was the very low levels of contaminants that were involved in this activity. And certainly from a local perspective, or just from a narrow perspective, one can say, why not filter and capture while we're going? Well, in a constrained funding environment, we have to make risk-based priorities, and it's understandable, perhaps, that something that's so far below regulatory levels is not as high a priority as some of the other things that we need to invest money in, where we have contaminants that are above regulatory levels. And so from a risk management perspective, it makes sense, but if you're talking just narrowly at this one activity, it does raise some questions that are understandable. But that's the broader picture that didn't quite get fully described in the press, and I thought it was important for the CAB to at least understand that broader perspective. And
Randy, if I just might add also, Mr. Chairman, that we also have obligations under DOE orders to consult with our tribal neighbors on a government-to-government basis. You know, we've been criticized in the past of using a decide and defend approach when we deal with our tribal neighbors. And we did consult with the new tribal government at San Ildefonso. We met with Governor Mountain because of the proximity of this emission point to the sacred area on Pueblo land. We understood that, and we visited with the governor, and so, you know, we believe the decision wasn't made quickly. It wasn't made in a cavalier manner, and it was made factoring in all of the things that Randy had said. And I just didn't think the news article brought that forward, and we appreciate the opportunity to share the kind of a broader perspective on that.
Help me understand, Randy, if at first we figured out that MVAL had a problem that we had to go address, and we went to address it, and now we're saying that it's not a problem because it's under regulatory requirements.
No, I maybe spoke too quickly or not clearly enough. So in the first phase of this remediation project, it's an exploratory phase where you're trying to understand how effective an extraction method might be. And when we started this, we did not know what the concentrations of these vapors might be in the air that we could pull up from this area of underground contamination. And so when we didn't know what the concentrations would be, we did the conservative approach to capture and filter that effluent. And based on the information we gathered during that exploratory phase, we determined that it was very low levels, well below regulatory levels for release. So a conservative approach to start, and then based on data, making a decision about the appropriate investment of funds for the execution phase.
I guess my next question would be: is that MVAL one of the deliverables or milestones that was included on the consent order? And if that's the case, are we done with MVAL?
Well, we're not done because we're just starting the operational phase of the remediation based on our exploratory phase. So Dave McEnroy could probably tell us what the duration of the operational phase of this remediation is, but I believe it's a couple of years at least. Dave?
Mr. Chair, committee members, Area L was a liquid disposal area used by the laboratory for about a 10-year time frame starting in, I believe, 1974, 75. And the potential volume of liquids that was disposed of in Area L approaches 50,000 gallons of liquids. If you just did a volume estimate that was, these were shafts that were drilled into the ground, and then containers and uncontainerized liquids poured into that shaft. So we've done a volume estimate, conservative volume estimate of the liquids that were poured in there. We've monitored it for nearly 12, 15 years of these vapors that have, through breaches of the containers, leaked out into the environment. We collect poor gas samples quarterly, and we can watch our mesas actually breathe with barometric pressure, and those vapors that are caught in the poor gas of the tufa up on our mesa tops actually exit the sidewalls of the mesas. But at the same time, there's concentrations of this liquid that are moving towards the water table. So it's one of our more complex sites, but we have modeled and determined that going without any sort of intermeasure near term, that there is a potential that some of that liquid could actually reach the water table. So that's why we propose to the state that we get out there and do vapor extractions as these drums or carboys or whatever the containers that were put into these shafts breach, and maintain a vapor concentration, if you will, in the vadose zone that does not have a chance to reach the groundwater. So this actually could be a decade of monitoring and extracting of those soil gases, volatile organics. So if we get into a long-term remediation like that, we may go back and revisit GAC, but granulated activated charcoal. But right now we're looking at, through using the EPA models, we're looking at generating, I think 5 times below the air quality standard at our boundaries and 70 times below the air quality standard to the nearest resident. So that was part of our decision making when we decided not to use the activated charcoal. So what we're doing right now is just monitoring the soil vapor plume, not monitoring, but extracting and maintaining it in place as those drums are determined to all have ruptured or containers have all released, and we get to a state where we're comfortable that there is not an opportunity for the organics to migrate to the groundwater.
Dave, just a question, because I think you probably would be able to answer this better. On the extraction well, the CREX1, when do you expect to start pumping that again and start analyzing, having the treatment plant work?
So early
start up operation again?
Right now our limiting factor is we land apply all the water that we pull from CREX1. So as soon as the freeze is over, our equipment is thawed out, if you will, and part of our land application permit requires that all the water has to infiltrate and not pond. So when the ground is thawed, we'll start up again. In the meantime, we're pursuing our permits with the state engineer's office that allow us to inject those waters. And when we have those permits and we can put in those injection wells, it becomes no longer a seasonal execution. It becomes you start it up and let her run. And right now we've planned for 2 boundary protection wells, if you will, that are going to change the gradient and keep the contamination from leaving the lab property, and then another well in the highest concentration of the plume to actually go after the source removal and get the highest bang for the buck. So it all revolves around when our water can re-infiltrate and when we get our injection well permits from the state engineer's office.
Thank you. Steve.
Yeah, this is a question on the soil vapor extraction system. Do you periodically monitor what you're extracting? You said initially it was well under the air quality standard, but do you periodically monitor in case you hit a rich pocket and suddenly...
Dave should just continue to stand at the microphone.
Yes, we actually monitor what we're extracting at the point of extraction. Initially 4 times a day for the first 2 days, and then daily for the following 22 days. And what that does is, and what it has done since January 9th is confirmed our models that what was coming out or what was expected to come out of those wells is exactly what's coming out of those wells. The other thing that wasn't mentioned, I think worth mentioning, is when we initially did this extraction test back in 2006, the concentrations were 4 times higher than they are now. So we did see some good results from our soil vapor extraction. And now, again, the concentrations are 4 times lower than what they were in 2006, which also made it more feasible to not use the activated charcoal. And to reiterate, we're seeing exactly what was predicted in our models.
So you continue to monitor over time?
We monitor over time. We owe the state's Air Quality Bureau a report every 6 months of what our results are, and we owe the Hazardous Waste Bureau a report 8 months after we started up the soil vapor extraction units themselves. There was one more. I'll just leave it at, well, I guess there has been, I'm going to preempt a question or two here. Maybe I can sit down. There was a question that came up, what if one of these drums breach? You know what your model says, given what your in situ measurements are now, but if you have a sudden breach of 50 drums, do you have an opportunity to exceed your model and increase the exhaust from the unit and expose? Well, these extraction units, the closest one is about 50 feet from one of these disposal shafts. So you would not see an immediate response in your samples and in your exhausting of the unit. If you did have a drum rupture, you may see something slightly increase over time, and you would have an opportunity to adjust your model, turn off the unit, or if you felt you were going to exceed a inhalation standard.
Allison, you had a question?
Yeah,
Did you want to ask Dave, or?
yeah, Dave.
Okay.
I just want to get it out there, the severity of the risk. I was really disappointed in the New Mexican story. It said something like, it literally said, no one knows how long it could take this material to migrate. And I thought, gosh, there's no science on that at all. That just doesn't seem right. I think someone knows or has some kind of context when you look at a vadose zone and you look at the water table. And isn't the vadose like 400 and the water table is like 1,000? Or is it a crazy straw situation and it can get there faster?
The vadose zone is closer to 800 at that location.
Okay.
And we do have a conservative model that would show if you had a catastrophic destruction of all of those drums at once and a catastrophic release, it would take on the order, I believe, what I recall, 15 to 20 years to hit the water table. Well, we haven't seen that catastrophic release, and what we believe we're seeing is a few drums or a couple containers, or our conservative estimates probably don't have an opportunity to reaching the water table as long as we keep maintaining and keep the concentrations of that poor gas in such a state that it doesn't turn into a liquid phase and actually can migrate. Right now it's just in an uncontained gaseous stage in the top 300 feet of the mesa that's breathing and actually volatilizes it out as barometric changes occur.
So that's what I wanted to get at. There is a great deal of caution and preventative a stance behind this activity, which will prevent a very narrow or randomly occurring event. It's not like this stuff is going to hit the drinking water tomorrow. And that sentence, no one knows when it will migrate, kind of implied that, and I just wanted to get that out on the table.
Well, we work very closely with the Hazardous Waste Bureau at the state. We share this information, our poor gas monitoring results from about 20 ports around this area quarterly with them. So we've watched this data for the last 8 years not change a bit, not since we remediated or did a partial remediation in 2006. If we start to see increasing trends, I'm sure the state would come to us immediately and say, we want you to do something more proactive than what you're doing now.